This might seem like a simple question, but what's the difference between having something called PLPD on your car insurance and having full coverage on your car insurance? There's a few misconceptions that people have with these types of coverages. Let's go in and explain exactly what's the difference between the two. For those that are purchasing a vehicle, it's really simple to understand. If you're buying a brand new vehicle, you want full coverage. That's essentially the term that was made up that allows you to have what's called comprehensive and collision. Now, technically, it's a made-up term because some people think it includes road service, some people think it includes gap insurance, some people think it includes all of these things, and that would be fully covered, but they don't typically have that. So when you read your policy and you've told someone full coverage, you may want to make sure you have the right coverages that you wanted. Now, we'll go a little bit further in depth on that in just a moment, but let's go back to the opposite to answer the question. PLPD, simple terms, is personal liability and property damage. It's just what you're liable for. It's what the state of Michigan requires you to have regardless of the car. If you have a car and you want to get insurance, you have to carry liability. That's if you injure someone, you're liable for it, or you're at fault, you have to pay for those damages or those injuries. And in that case, your insurance will kick in and pay for that. Now, it's a little bit tricky. I'll link a video that goes a little bit more in depth, but it's a little bit tricky in Michigan because we have something called personal injury protection. So we technically carry our own medical, or what you call a no-fault state. So when I get hurt and my car's damaged, I go to my insurance. If that guy or girl gets hurt and they get damaged, they go to their insurance. Now, the insurances are still going to go behind the scenes and fight it out and figure it out without you. That way you're not being liable and having to fight back and forth. Any extra that the insurance doesn't cover, which is fairly rare to ever happen, would fall onto that personal liability that you have to carry. So personal liability and property damage. Since we're using Michigan as an example, $50,000 per person is the lowest liability you have to carry, $100,000 per accident. In that case, honestly, you're never going to carry that, because what a lot of people don't understand is bumping it to $50,000 or $100,000 property damage. You're talking pennies. It's not going to cost you more than a few cents a month to have that extra coverage. That's why in Michigan, most of us carry that extra coverage. There's some additional coverages we'll mention in a moment that actually cover you outside of that. That's why you don't actually have that extra cost to have that better option. So how do you determine which one you should carry? Should I do PLPD or full coverage? That's really the risk that you're willing to take versus the value of the vehicle that you own. So if I have a $5,000 car that I paid $5,000 for, or even if I paid $1,000 for it, it's whatever the car is worth at the time. So that car might be worth $5,000. If I don't care about the car and I can afford to buy another one, then PLPD is probably my best option. If I do care about the car and I do want to make sure I get covered, then I'm going to have to carry that comprehensive and collision coverage that we're calling full coverage in this scenario. The other part you have to think about is what deductible. So when you carry full coverage, you have different levels of deductibles. Now, this is where it gets a little bit pricey because you can choose a low deductible and pay nothing out of pocket. So if it's my fault or not my fault, I don't care what it is. I don't want to pay anything out of pocket. So you can have that. What most people do is they go to about a $500 deductible. That's the most common, but you can go anywhere from $0 as high as $2,500. Some companies can go a little bit higher, but I've honestly never seen anyone do it that high. Most commonly, you're either $500 or $1,000 for the collision. Now, we also mentioned something about comprehensive. What's that? Comprehensive is other than collision. That means if you hit a deer, if you hit an animal, a tree falls on your car, hail damages the roof, things like that, that aren't actual vehicle accidents where you have the property if you hit or damage somebody or your car or vice versa. This is more a car is usually just sitting there or you're driving and you hit an animal. In that case, you have comprehensive, also has its own deductible. It's usually less expensive to insure, so you can probably lower that deductible a little bit more. I'll be honest, a lot of people just do 500, 500. So that's 500 comprehensive, 500 collision, and they do what's called the standard coverage. There's a little bit more to unravel there because it gets a little confusing in Michigan because of this no-fault piece when you have different levels of collision. So when you have broad form, standard, and limited. The limited is where you can't go after your car. Your car's not covered if you're the one at fault. If you're not at fault, it's covered, but you pay your deductible no matter what. It doesn't matter what happened, you're out pocketing that. That's the risk you're taking for a lower price. The standard, or also known as regular collision, is where it's just a flat. Doesn't matter your fault, their fault, you just pay out of pocket. The biggest difference between the limited is that it doesn't matter whose fault it was. No matter what, you were saying, I want the car covered, I'm willing to pay out of pocket no matter what happened. Now you've got the broad form, which is a little bit more expensive. You'll have to talk to your agent to find out exactly the cost, because it can vary depending on the location and the profile of the person. So that broad form will mean if I'm not at fault, I don't pay the deductible. So now I actually feel a little bit more proud that I'm not causing the accident and I'm not paying out of pocket. Now there's other coverages that can protect you there, but it's just more work on your end. So you have what's called limited property damage, otherwise known as a mini tort, and that allows you to go after the person more damages than you get. For example, and hopefully I'm not losing you, put a 1 in the comments below if you guys are caught up with me. 2 if you just don't understand what Mark's talking about. The point of that is to cover you if you have extra costs. So let's say, for example, I chose that limited and I had to pay out of pocket $500, or I chose the regular and it wasn't my fault and I had to pay out of pocket $500, and I didn't have rental car coverage, so I had to go rent a car. And it cost me $30 a day for 10 days. So that's $300 there, $500 here. I have $800 worth of bills. I was out of town, I wasn't near my house, so I had to tow it home. That's another $100, so now I'm out $900. I can, if I have that coverage, go after your insurance to recoup that $900 back. That gives me the ability to technically do a small claims lawsuit. I can go up to $3,000 to return that money back into my pocket. Most people carry that coverage because it's almost no cost for you to purchase. Hopefully your agent has written that on your policy. It should say limited tort or mini tort or limited property damage. By the way, if this is confusing or you are looking for a new agent, I'll put a link in the description below where you can work with one of our team members. We work mainly in Michigan, but we work in multiple states. So if you're not in Michigan and you're watching this, curious about some more about your state, I'll put a link in the description below the states that we're licensed in, and feel free to fill out a quote. We'd be happy to help. Now let's talk costs. So what's costing what? The PLPD is the cheapest way you can go. If you want the cheapest, absolute low cost price you can get, that's the route. Commonly, if you have a young driver and the cost is really expensive, you buy them an inexpensive car, list them as the driver of that vehicle, and then they have that coverage. They're still covered for their medical, their liability, all of those are picked separately. They just don't cover the car. Now the comprehensive, like we said, is not as expensive, so it's usually not going to cost you as much to have just comprehensive. So if you're more worried about theft and vandalism and deer and a tree falling on your car, something like that, then sure, the comprehensive you can just add on to that policy. It's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, but you're probably going to have a small significant increase in the premium. The collision is where the majority of the cost is, because now we're covering the entire car. Now the limited one is not as expensive, but in all honesty, no one takes that, because it's your fault and you're not covered. It doesn't work. Especially if you have a loan, they won't let you carry that anyway. So having either the regular or the broad form starts to creep the price up a little bit to where you're going to spend a few hundred extra more dollars to have the vehicle covered. There are those additional pieces that you have to think out beyond that. If you have a loan that's a really high loan, you may want to consider gap insurance. It's commonly cheaper to buy through your car insurance than it is to buy from the dealership. You can play with those numbers and see what fits, but it's usually not very expensive. Some companies call them a savings bank deductible. So if you have a claim, you've essentially paid more into the insurance so that you're not going to necessarily have to out-pocket much, if at all, when you do actually have a claim. Now that you have that knowledge of what PLPD versus full coverage is, you may want to know what the personal injury protection gets a little bit more detailed and actually, oddly enough, a little bit more confusing, even though there's some simple ways to figure it out. If you want to learn about the medical portion, I'll put a link to the video there. If you're still trying to understand the car insurance and want to learn more of the specifics, I'll put our car insurance 101 there. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Otherwise, I'm Mark with Valor Insurance. We'll see you soon.